Good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast, and on the West Coast, good morning. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Keyline Interactive. My name is Kelly Narcisse, and I'm going to be your host today. Thank you all for joining us. We're excited to talk with Keyline Interactive's Director of Quantitative Research, Dana Bishop, and our user experience researcher, Phil McGuinness, about best practices for competitive benchmarking. They're going to be discussing a variety of topics about importance of taking the proper time for building a strong foundation for your benchmarking study to questions you should be asking yourself before you're starting. So we have a good presentation for you ahead. Dana and Phil both joined the Keyline team a couple years ago. Dana has 20 years of experience in UX and is a lead author of hundreds of industry reports from retail, travel, financial services, and many more. Phil has become our expert in design and programming of online surveys. He has extensive experience as a data analyst and study co-developer. So just before getting started, let's quickly cover a couple of guidelines to keep in mind throughout the next 60 minutes. We do want this talk to be interactive for you guys, so there's going to be two channels where you can ask questions in real time during the webinar. First, you can post a question on the right-hand side. You should see an empty box where you can post your questions in that chat window. You can also follow this conversation with us on Twitter using our hashtag KLIEvents. We have a lot of time at the end of this discussion for a Q&A, and we're going to do our best at that point to get to everyone's questions. So for questions we may not get a chance to answer, don't worry. We are going to reach out to everyone following this webinar with all of the responses today and any questions we didn't get to. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass this off over to Dana and Phil and let them kick it off.
Great. Thank you, Kelly, and thank you and welcome to everyone who has dialed in to attend today. I'm very pleased to be here with Phil McGuinness today, who I've been collaborating with on competitive benchmarking studies for, gosh, more than 5 years now. So we've learned a few things along the way and wanted to share some of our experiences, tips, and best practices with you. So let's start at the beginning, which is really what should you be asking yourself in order to build a strong foundation for your benchmarking study as you're planning it and designing it. So it's really important to remember this is not a one-off project. You're designing it once, and you're going to be running it multiple times, whether it's over the course of a year or years to come. So before you jump in, you really want to take the proper time for planning. Ask yourself some really essential fundamental questions. So let's start with the most fundamental of questions first. Why? So why benchmark? Why do I want to benchmark? Why should I be benchmarking? Should I be benchmarking? And doing competitive benchmarking. So benchmarking creates a baseline on your site, your app, gives you a good starting point, right? So from which you want to measure against in the future. So it's creating a baseline for you. And those insights that you're going to gather will help establish goals to guide you in terms of where to focus your efforts to improve and optimize your user experience. So also, you want to keep testing over time. You're not going to just do it once, right? So you want to track how the experience changes over time. You want to track and measure changes in key performance indicators. You want to conduct benchmarking studies at regular intervals, possibly. So you might want to run it quarterly, annually, depending on your development cycle. And then sometimes you want to retest and do a benchmarking study before and after rolling out, say, a major update or redesign. So there's different situations in which it makes sense to run your benchmarking study. So that's benchmarking yourself. So now we're going to talk a little bit about why include competitors, right? So what am I getting from that? Aren't I really just interested in my own product, site, app? Well, by benchmarking your competitors, it really provides you a valuable way to measure how you perform relative to your competitors, which is important because let's face it, we're not in a bubble by ourselves. So you can interpret your usability standing, your feature set, and much more in relation to the competition. You can learn from their successes and failures, not just your own, and really gain insight into what's working well, what's not working well, and why on their site. And it really helps to identify best-in-class examples that you may want to emulate or consider yourself, rather than staying really myopic and focused just on yourself. So it really helps companies to sort of broaden that view and, as I said, learn from others. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to you, Phil, to talk about a recent case study. I know you worked on this study, and it's relevant to what we're talking about today.
All right, thanks, Dana. Yeah, I think this really exemplifies some of the things that you pointed out in the last two slides. And I think Dana get a bit of an echo back. So this study was about an international electronics company that wanted to measure shopping for a mobile phone, both on their mobile site and their desktop site. So they were looking at their own sites as well as their direct competitors. And they were interested in a few tasks. So we looked at the homepage performance, product research, purchasing a product, and also customer support. And what we learned from that was that the mobile sites for all of the brands that we tested, everyone we looked at, weren't meeting the same standards set by the desktop sites. And I think anyone that's been in usability for the past few years at least has seen that customers are really looking to perform everything on mobile that they can on desktop. So seeing that gap was a little bit scary, and it told them that they really need to step up their mobile site game. We also noticed that for our clients specifically, the mobile site scored low in the product research task. So when people were looking for a specific product, they were having more trouble relative to competitors on our client's site. We did find that the sales in the product purchase and the support tasks, they were meeting industry standards, so there was no need for special focus on those areas after the study. But we did find some navigational best practices from the other sites, the competitor sites, that could be incorporated for better success rates site-wide. And so that's why I think this is a good example of some of those things that Dana was talking about. They learned a little bit about their site specifically, as well as learning from other competitor sites. So you really got both why should you benchmark yourself and why should you benchmark against others from this specific example. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the question what. So what are you benchmarking and what are your goals? So you really want to take the time up front, and we will harp on this throughout the presentation, that you really have to plan and design properly for these types of studies for various reasons. You really want to identify any questions, concerns, areas of interest, and the real purpose of what you're doing. And this could involve talking to various stakeholders throughout the company, understanding any business concerns, reviewing any previous knowledge and research into these areas, because it's likely that your team or your customers have identified issues with the website already. So you really want to make sure that you dive deep on those questions and figure out why they're happening, why these problems are arising. And so during this planning stage, you're making sure that you will collect the data you need so you can make those design decisions, and that you're designing all of your tasks and questions very specifically so you get those answers, so you can either confirm your hypothesis that you started with or refute it. And then finally, you need to stay focused. It's very tempting to make these studies extremely long and cover all bases, but you're going to run into things like survey fatigue when people are performing online. You really don't want to go over 20 to 25 minutes as the absolute longest online survey. And so anything that's not tied directly to your top questions or research objectives, you really need to cut out. Additionally, because you're going to be running this multiple times, and guess what? Next year, you're probably going to want to add to it. So just making sure when you're starting it off that it's short enough that you have a little bit of room to grow over the years. And another just warning before we get started is to plan carefully. When you're doing this type of research, this quantitative research, it's different if you focus primarily on qualitative before. If you're doing a qualitative study, you might start with a general outline or discussion guide of what you want to look at, and then in the middle of fielding, you might decide to focus on something specific, or even in the middle of a session, a participant might bring something up and you'll say, oh, you know what, we really want to dive into that one. But with quantitative benchmarking research tools, a lot of times when you launch that study, you're locked in. So you'll get a warning on these online tools that, once you're launched, you can't change a lot. So that could involve having to scrap some of your early data if you really have a key change that you want to make. But really, you should get ahead of it and make sure that you're handling these issues before you launch. So that means, number one, make sure that all stakeholders, all interested parties have had their input before you launch. Number two, you want to test the study personally and also soft launch with just a few participants to make sure that the flow is correct. You will likely have people that are successful on a task, for instance, ask certain questions, whereas those who are unsuccessful, you want to know why. So that's another key point. You're not just getting these numbers, you're not just getting who's successful and who's not. You really want to dig into the why of these. You really want the context of why someone is failing at a particular task. Otherwise, the numbers are not going to help you. And then finally, look at your reporting tools and the patterns of data that are coming out from each online tool. It's important that you're making sure your data is coming out in a manageable format for the analysis. You can make it a lot harder for yourself by programming the survey incorrectly or designing it incorrectly, and then later you're manually adding together, say, the people who were successful and unsuccessful. Maybe they answered the same question, but in different parts of the online tool. If you can script it correctly, those numbers will be added for you, but if you don't, then you're going to be adding those manually later for hundreds or even thousands of participants. So it's really important to make sure you're planning very carefully. And then I'm going to pass it back to Dana to talk about who we're working with when benchmarking.
Great, thanks, Phil. So now we kind of talked about the setup and your goals and your objectives, and next is who should the participants be, right? So clearly the greatest insights that we get are from real users. You need to go a little further than just real users. Typically, you need people who are coming to your site or your intended audience, right? So you need your users or your target audience. There are a number of ways to get at those folks and make sure that you're tapping into the right people and having them participate. You can recruit participants who match particular demographics, or better yet, personas if you have them. So if you've developed different personas for your customer base, then that's great that you have something very specific to recruit to. Obviously, we create screener surveys that will qualify or disqualify participants based on that predefined criteria that might be age or previous experience or any kind of other demographic or trait or attitude. And there's a number of different options for recruiting. So obviously professional panel partners is a great way to find people who meet specific criteria. However, sometimes you want existing customers or site visitors. So you want to recruit directly from either your customer list or your client's customer list, or do an online intercept survey where you're actually intercepting or popping up a message asking people to participate from the actual site or sites that you're testing. That gets a little more complicated, obviously, in competitive benchmarking with other sites, but there are ways around that. The biggest thing with benchmarking, again, because we're running this study multiple times, it's not a one-off study, so consistency is imperative when it comes to your sample. So to get really reliable longitudinal data that eliminates any kind of skewed data, you really need the same screener each time you run the benchmarking study. You need to keep proportions even across the competitors. So for instance, in your different age ranges, number of people who maybe had previous experience or lack of experience with a brand or with doing a particular thing online, any other demographics that you're tracking, the really key ones really need to be kept even in proportion across competitors and also from benchmark to benchmark, so from quarter to quarter or year to year. That consistency, again, you want to keep the data as clean as possible and have the results be comparable, and you want to eliminate any sort of factors that would come in and skew the data other than performance, site performance, design, usability, all of those things. So you really want to pay close attention to that when you are doing your participants. And so, Phil, I know that there's a case study. I'm going to hand it back to you for a minute to talk about this travel industry study.
Thanks, Dana. Yeah, this one I think speaks to a lot of the things that Dana covered in the previous slide. This is a syndicated report that we do for the travel industry year after year. And so we have a certain demographic that we look at. We look at people who book travel online. And so we look at it across 7 or 8 sites. And we had another client approach us who has kind of a different demographic that they like to focus on. They have a family-friendly kind of brand. And so they were interested in that specific demographic, which maybe isn't as important to the rest of the competitor groups in the study. And so what we did was we, rather than changing the sample going to their site, we added an additional sample of 200 participants who were people that traveled with their children, so traveled with their family. And that allowed us to not only keep our benchmark going for the other sites, but to focus specifically on what that client wanted. So we're no strangers to doing a little bit of custom manipulation on the side to get data that our clients want. And what we learned was actually very interesting. The company brand for this specific demographic was particularly strong. Many of the metrics that we studied, the brand metrics, performed significantly better than they did in the standard sample of people that book travel online. We also found that metrics like satisfaction, ease of use, and visual appeal were significantly higher among that target demographic. So it was mostly good news for our client based on this demo that they were targeting, and it kind of reaffirmed their thoughts that they were that they're really pushing their brand and pushing that family-friendly aspect of their brand through their site. So I thought it was just a great example. And then I'm going to pass it back to Dana to talk a little bit more about these participants and sample sizes and things like that.
Great, thanks, Phil. All right, go to the next slide. So again, kind of following through with who the participants should be. So we talked about sort of demographics and screening and where you get them from. So how many participants do you need, right? So we get this question a lot, and for a lot of our competitive benchmarking studies, we really rely on larger sample sizes in order to get statistically significant and sound results. I'm going to talk a little bit more on the slides coming in the next couple of slides about statistically significant results, and the whole deal here is the confidence increases with the sample size, right? So does the accuracy of our measures. With these benchmarking studies, oftentimes companies are can be making pretty big decisions based on benchmarking. For instance, we're running a study for a client right now. They just rolled out a major redesign, and this is kind of a big deal for them to benchmark it against the previous site. It was a very large effort, very big rollout of a new site, and I wouldn't say they're holding their breath. They seem pretty confident that it's going to test much better than the old site design. But again, some significant decisions, design decisions and development decisions were made last year based on the benchmarking data that we got. So again, the statistically significant numbers, sound data, are really pretty critical to a lot of these studies that we run. So so for between subject benchmarking studies, as a rule of thumb, sample sizes for us are usually between about 150 or 300 per site. There's a couple of factors that influence that. One of the considerations is, are we including multiple segments or groups? So are we comparing 2 or more different groups, like customers or prospects, or people who have experience, don't have experience? Are we going to break that number down? And if we are, we have to think about what that looks like and whether we can make reliable comparisons between 2 subgroups. So you don't want your numbers to get too small. So if you start with 100 and you want to look at 3 different subgroups, if you will, comparing 33 is the sample size is not quite large enough for really sound data that you're going to want to make some major decisions off of. So let's talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So population. So what the population is really the entire group of people that you would like to understand. We can't talk to every single person in the population. And in this example, I'm defining it with a specific criteria. So not everyone in the whole world, but primary care physicians, let's say, who see cancer patients. So for a healthcare client, they're interested in this group. Obviously, we're not going to be able to talk to everyone. We want to take a sample of that group. So a fraction of that population that models the entire population. So at the bottom I have, so the graphic on the upper right, so the population, let's say that population within the primary care physicians is about 13%, okay? So by using a smaller sample size versus a bigger sample size, in the graphic in the bottom center, you can see that it's kind of the metaphor of casting a wider net, right? So the chances, if you're using a larger sample size, you get more accurate results in terms of that sample and whether it's really mirroring back to the population, whereas smaller sample size sometimes can be unreliable because you're not quite hitting that. So the larger samples are more representative of the population. However, I will say that we need to also be aware of diminishing returns and balance out that need for greater accuracy with cost implications, right? So there's a diminishing return at a certain point where more is not better. There's no real purpose to testing 600, 800, 1,000 people, right? Because you can see there's sort of a drop off here in terms of statistical significance and certainty, and it levels off. And again, kind of the sweet spot that we find is between 150, 200, and 300 people. 200 is kind of our certain number that we rely on pretty often for that reason. So Phil, do you want to talk a little bit more about the how, or the tools and how we collect benchmarking data?
Yeah, and before we dive into that, I saw a couple questions come in, so I just thought I'd handle those before we move on. One I think might have been answered, but I'll do it explicitly. It was, do you use between subject or within subject design for competitive benchmarking? Now, what we typically use, as Dana mentioned a couple slides back, was between subject design, and that allows us, we actually control the demographics very carefully, and that allows us to get a really good equal comparison across all of these different sites. So definitely between subject there. And then the other question was about the case study in the travel industry and the family-friendly group. And it was, do you use the family-friendly sample for competitors' site too? And the answer to that is no, we did not. And what we were looking at specifically there was comparing that family-friendly sample to the company's performance with the main demographic. Now, if they were interested in seeing how all of the sites performed with a family-friendly group, that's kind of a different question, and we could have compared across sites. But our client was particularly interested in how they were performing with that group. So that was the desire, and that's why we did the study in that particular way.
I will add to that we also did run the regular sample on that site. So we were not only able to compare, we were able to compare apples to apples, the exact same demographics across all of their competitors and themselves. And then we were also able to look at that special oversampling demographic that we did for them and see if there were differences, right, between sort of the general population of sort of online travel bookers versus their more specific demographic.
Exactly. Thank you, Dana. So now that those are answered, I'll talk a little bit about how we perform these studies. So we talked about why we would do it. We talked about what you want to test and learn and who you would recruit. So now it's about selecting the best strategy and the tools you're going to use to conduct your benchmarking study. And as Kelly mentioned, that's kind of been my special area of focus, is working with these online survey tools and understanding them and their strengths and weaknesses. So you want to ask yourself a few questions before you get started. It's, what type of data and metrics do you want to track? Who is your target market? And how much time and budget you have, if that's particularly relevant to your study. You have to remember that you're going to design this study once and run it multiple times. So this is, I mean, you're making a decision for maybe a couple years out when you're making the choice on the tool. And these online applications, they do make it easy to repeat or rerun a study in the future. A lot of times it's a matter of just copying and pasting a script, touching up a few things and adding any new questions and then just launching it. So that first scripting is very important, but after that you've saved some work in the next year or the next time you're going to run it. And there are many different tools out there. So we actually have some things that will help you choose the right tool for conducting and analyzing your study. Now, what you see here is actually a couple slides from a previous webinar that we did, or I did just a couple months ago, and it can be found at the bit.ly link on the right. But this is one slide that compares some of the common task-based research tools in the top left about what they can really offer. So in terms of the click streams or behavioral data as someone goes through your website, UserZoom currently provides the best offering in our opinion, whereas Loop 11 also provides a level of click streams, but it has kind of a different approach. So this was all covered in that webinar. We highly recommend you check that out. In the bottom right, you can see this is part of a PDF that helps you. It's a flow chart that helps you select a survey tool, and there are different questions that guide you to different possible answers based on what you're looking at. And the full-size image is available on our website, or you can just go to keylimeinteractive.com and click on our blog. There's a lot of good information there. So just letting you know those resources are available, and you can learn about many different research tools, not just the few that are called out here. These are kind of specific to competitive benchmarking, or they're good for competitive benchmarking, but we cover a number of other tools online as well. And then I'll pass it back to Dana for our last slide here.
Great. So we've talked about being clear up front what you want to test, who to include, how to kind of go about that, a little bit about deciding how many people. Bill talked a little bit about tools, and like I said, we have a lot more information on the specifics of that. And then sort of the last piece is, okay, so now it's time to analyze your benchmarking data. And really the thing here that we've learned through trial and fire for many years is, if you, and again, we're sort of beating this point home, but if you took the time up front to really identify everything that you're doing, be really clear and focused on what you're doing, the purpose of the research, the specific research questions you want answered, the specific metrics that you're trying to track, and all of those things, and you design your study with the data analysis in mind, then it's going to be a breeze. So it's really about working smarter and not harder. Obviously, the online tools make it easy to repeat the study, you know, but really it's about knowing what you're going to do with every single piece of data that you're collecting, right? Every single question you're putting in there should really be thought through in terms of, I used to work with somebody who was very adamant that you could build your report out, the shell of your report out, before you have any data. And you should be able to do that, and you should be doing that. So you know exactly what the report is going to look like, what, you know, your framework for the results are going to be, and then you're just going to flow your results in. You're going to confirm your hypothesis or debunk them. You're going to explain the why behind different metrics and different performance, dips up or down over time. You're going to give that qualitative feedback that we always collect. We really, a lot of the benchmarking that we do really includes behavioral data, where people go within an app or a site, and then also the metrics that we've been talking about, success and satisfaction and conversion and brand metrics and things like that, tracking those over time, and then also really anticipating and designing your study for the qualitative feedback. So, you know, one of the things that's great about the in-lab experience and a lot of qualitative work is you can really dig deep with people, and you can, you know, with benchmarking and with a lot of online research, you really have to anticipate what those questions are going to be. And again, if you're setting it up and you know how you want to analyze the data, you don't know what the answers are going to be yet, but you're very clear about what the questions are, and you're very clear that if someone rates something very low, you want to be asking them why, so that you can be putting that in your analysis, and you're not just watching numbers and performance numbers going up and down over the years with no explanation. Without the context, it's really not that helpful to have numbers changing over time. And it's great to track information, but not if you can't tie it back to the reasons why the performance of a particular competitor is going up or down. So it's really important. And then you also want to know what best-in-class features you want to be looking at. So again, if you designed your study to ask specific research, answer specific research questions, you know what areas you're going to be looking at, whether it's navigation and visual appeal, whether it's research, purchase processes, whatever it might be. You kind of, again, should be designing that study with your analysis in mind and know what you're going to be doing before you even get started. So again, we find the analysis piece, you pay off, you get your payoff at the end if you did your work up front. So that's kind of it for our slides. I know we have some extra time left for Q&A. Kelly, do we have any additional questions that have come in from participants that we want to discuss at this point, other than the ones that Phil already covered?
Sure. Let's go ahead and jump in. We have a few questions that came in. So I'm going to start with the first one that came in just a bit ago. How do you benchmark enterprise or business software where the majority are power users and novice experiences are less important? Also, how do you structure tasks for power users? And when and how do these things differ based on the business processes?
That's a great question. I was looking at that as it came in. Hi, everyone. We thought we'd make an appearance here for the Q&A. So that's a really good question, and it seems like it might be for a very specific need. I would definitely say that when the practices differ based on the business procedures, you might look at different metrics like time on task. If the task is the same across different sites, looking at the time on task will actually still give you a pretty good comparison of how these different tools are performing. But because this question is so detailed and specific, I would recommend, I would want to know more about what you're looking at. So feel free to contact us after the webinar, and you can email us at the email on the screen here, and we'd be happy to help work with you on your specific need for that detailed question.
Cool, thanks. We have a question that just came in, so I'll just jump right to that one as well. How long does it normally take to plan, conduct, and analyze a competitive benchmark study?
Right, well, I'll take that one, just for the sake of taking turns. So, you know, the first time is where you put your time in, right? So the first time that you're creating your benchmark, your baseline for the benchmark, you could spend several weeks planning and designing the study. It really depends on your back and forth with your client. So, you know, there's usually a review period, and if you're really getting that, as I think Phil mentioned up front, the stakeholders, right? So really understanding, really talking to your client. I mean, we consult, so we're dealing with clients rather than doing research for ourselves, but internally, if you're doing research, making sure that you have all that. So that process can take 2 to 3 weeks the first time around. Fielding, again, depending on what kind of numbers you're looking at, how many competitors you're including, how difficult the panelists may be to find, so to speak, or to recruit. Sometimes the studies take longer if it's a very specific or long list of criteria versus just general population. Those can go very quickly. So fielding could be anywhere from literally a couple days to a few weeks. We've had things in the field longer. That's not generally the plan, but it happens. And then depending on the kind of analysis you do, we run driver analysis occasionally, or if we're doing analysis, that cycle is usually a couple of weeks as well. So it can be as much as little as about a 6-week cycle. And then when you rerun the study, so you know there are several benchmarks we've been running for several years. You know, every time after these, it's a much quicker design piece up front. Sometimes we'll update things, we will tweak it, maybe add an extra question or two, but it's really just a matter of preparing it and launching it. So you know, you really save in that upfront piece, and then the fielding team each year, as well as the report writing and analysis. So that answers that.
Yes. So this one actually goes a little bit hand in hand with the one that you just answered, and you might have touched on this a bit. But they're also asking, what's your thought on using existing customers for your site and competitors versus using someone who has no experience with either your site or your competitors?
Well, I mean, Phil, I'll start by answering and then I'll ask you to chime in. It really depends on in my experience, it depends what the client wants. So we run an annual benchmark right now that it's 50-50, right? So it's kind of 50% who have no experience doing this particular type of online research or processes. Other times I ran a study a couple of years ago where we did 1/3 of people who were customers of the brand, 1/3 who were not, but would consider, 1/3 who were current customers, 1/3 who would consider that brand for a trip in the future, and the third was they didn't really have any experience and it wasn't necessarily, they were a complete prospect. So it was kind of segmented in 3 different groups, and it really depends on the situation, Phil. I mean, sometimes some of our customers are really only interested in their site visitors or their customers. And not
I think I would agree. It depends on what you're trying to find out. You'll get different information from people who have never heard of you than you will from people who are loyalists. So I would say you definitely want a mix. But if you're just trying to benchmark your site for people that are already visiting it, then that's who you should focus on. But if you're trying to look at people that have never even maybe you're trying to snare new customers from a group that wouldn't typically consider even doing that type of travel, then I would focus at least partially on that group as well. So just really depends.
One thing to mention with the brand is I know that for years now we've been using a method of benchmarking before and after brand perception, right? So we'll ask them based on what you know, what's your feeling about this brand? How would you rate this brand? Before they do the evaluation. We will also ask, have you ever heard of this brand? It depends on really what the study is. Some of the brands are so well known that that's sort of a moot question, moot point. But we'll ask before and after, and we'll be able to measure the difference in that 20-minute experience has on the brand perception, right? So sometimes we'll see a brand start very strong, right? People have a very high opinion of brand X, right? And then maybe brand Y, not such a high opinion, and we find out it's really because there's not as much of familiarity. It's not sort of a household name, if you will. But what we're really interested in is that delta of pre to post and really being able to tie that back to the experience they had using the site. So again, if somebody starts out with a 60% positive brand perception and they end up with a 55%, somebody else starts out with a 20% positive brand perception and ends up with 70, there's a big difference between those two things. So again, that's always of interest to us to look at things like that.
Great, thanks. So you talked a lot about targeting participants properly. Where do you source those participants from?
I'll let you take that one, Phil.
Yeah, that's my specialty. So typically for these types of online quantitative research studies, unmoderated, you're using panel companies. So companies like Research Now, like SSI, there's many of them that specialize in very different things. So that's really a topic in itself, is choosing the right one amongst all these partners. But they actually build large online panels of people in the sizes up to millions, and you can source participants from there. And when you're doing that, you want to target specific demographics based on what you want. Alternatively, you can do things like intercept them on your website through a pop-up box when they visit, if you're looking specifically at site visitors, or you could use a customer list. And each of these recruiting methods really has its own intricacies and challenges. Like a customer list, you're probably going to get a really low response rate. Around maybe 5% of people that you send it out to are actually going to participate. So you need a pretty large customer list to actually run one of these studies. So it depends on what you want, but those are kind of the main methodologies for getting your participants in.
Thanks. So someone is curious to know, have you done any competitive benchmark studies for nonprofits?
I have not. I would probably point that at Dana, but I do know of a panel that specializes in recruiting people from nonprofits. So that's about as close as I would get to actually doing competitive benchmarking on nonprofits. Dana, do you have any experience there?
Actually, in all the benchmarking I've done, there's not been a nonprofit client yet.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, next question. We have a lot coming in. You mentioned about doing your own heuristic review before you jump into actual benchmarking. Is there any particular heuristics or criteria that you have found useful over different industries?
I can start, and Phil, please add to what I'm saying. Sometimes it's a heuristic review, sometimes it's sort of an expert review. For sure, you want to, at minimum, walk through, let's say it's a task-based benchmarking study. You definitely want to walk through all of the tasks on all of the sites or all of the applications and do your own assessment. You're looking for things having to do with clarity of messaging, maybe pricing clarity, process, so steps in a process. Is it clear, the navigation clear? Is it clear where to start or begin a particular task, whether you're researching something or whether you're trying to purchase something, whether if you're adding something to favorites and accessing that, if you're registering, you want to go through from an expert standpoint and review everything. And again, this is where the scripting and what Phil was talking about, the difference between being in lab and being able to react to what somebody is saying or trouble that they're having or anything. This is all part of anticipating and building in a really good study design that's going to anticipate where people may get tripped up and make sure that we're putting some conditional logic in there to ask the question and anticipate that, hey, do you see this here? I think there might be some confusion here. I think people may not be clear how to close this window or how to go from this step to this step, or boy, that buy now button is way below the fold and it's really hidden, or so that's kind of the process that we generally go through. We do a lot of usability type things that we look for, and in helping to design and anticipate problems that we want to dig down into. And again, you have to do it in a way that we're not asking them, hey, was it really hard to do this? Obviously there's no leading questions, but you're anticipating that, hey, we should definitely, there's definitely some issues around, the price keeps changing as you're going through the process and you're not being warned, right? So we'll see that sometimes and we'll say, let's make sure that if someone checks that off as a problem, the pricing was unclear, that we follow up and say, can you be more specific, specifically what was unclear? Things like that. So it's really part of our process to do a really thorough review of all of the sites, all the competitors before.
Yeah, and I don't know if you touched on this specifically. I think we were kind of skirting around it, but it's doing that due diligence to figure out specifically what problems and frustrations people might encounter, and it serves you well in the analysis stage, because if you can identify potential problems and put those in like a multiple choice question, rather than having to sort through the open ends of 1,000+ participants, then it's going to make your analysis a lot quicker at the end of the day. So it really is getting to know the sites or the tasks so well that you can kind of categorize those different potential problems, and that will make your job a lot easier at the end of the day.
And we have different problems and frustrations. I mean, you and I have been doing this together for a long time. We have different problems and frustrations we use for different industries or for different types of tasks or different types of, they're kind of the standard set, and then there's the ones we add in after we look at the specific competitors. And we're, so there's kind of a starting point, and then it kind of grows from there to make sure we're covering as many bases, like you said, in those multiple choice questions. So we're not having to dig through and find too many answers that are too hard to figure out.
Thanks. Okay, next question. Do you ever do different benchmark tasks for different customer groups within a benchmark to cover the whole experience? So an example, sign up for prospective users, detailed search refinements for more current users, etc.
Sure. So this is one of those cases that you would want to use, have more participants, because you're going to have maybe you have 8 tasks that your client really wants people to do, and 4 of them are much more sort of prospect, or first-time user based or oriented versus the others, and you split it up and you have people randomly selected to do a certain set of tasks, right? So you have 8 tasks, and as Phil mentioned, we can't have someone spend more than 20-25 minutes doing an online evaluation. 8 tasks is 2 times too many. So yes, there are times when we split it up because of sheer volume, or because they're really targeted towards customers or first-time site visitors that have to register or create an account, or things like that. So yes, we do often do that, and again, that's where you really puzzle out the study design and make sure that it's sustainable over time, and that you can keep using it, and that again, it's not a one-time solution, that it's something that you can continue to run and benchmark and grow with.
Yeah, and you have to be careful when you do that, because you've suddenly split your sample size in half when you're trying to analyze at the end of the day. So if you have half of your, maybe 200 participants, and then you split them, now you only have 100 participants. So how significant are those numbers at the end of the day? You're now working with maybe a smaller population, but the smaller sample size means you're a little bit less accurate. So you have to be careful if you're splitting your sample too many ways.
Great. Okay, let's keep moving on. What in particular would make a competitive benchmark study more attractive than something like an expert review of competitors?
Okay, well, I think this gets to the heart of the value of a competitive benchmarking study. And specifically compared to an expert review, you're actually getting real consumers or real users to look at your website. So an expert can do a lot of things for you, but you're never going to get that same quality data, that same consumer feedback that you would get from a competitive benchmarking study. Dana, do you agree with that?
Absolutely. There are exceptions to that, of course. A lot of the benchmarking we do relies on real user data, a lot of certainly usability or UX-focused benchmarks. However, Phil and I are co-authors of a series of reports that we do that are competitive index reports. And that's kind of a split of kind of an expert review or feature assessment across a number of competitors in a particular, in a number of industries, including the banking industry. For instance, we look at 8 different banks, and we look at all of their mobile capabilities, right, across all of the banks, and we track that over time. We run it every 6 months, and so that's sort of one component where it's really about kind of that detailed feature assessment: who has what's changed in the last 6 months, what are the trends that we're seeing, what are the sort of innovative things people are doing. And the other component is we talk to, we survey 500 consumers to see what their priorities are, and then we sort of cross-sect those 2 things of who's keeping up with and who is in the best alignment with what consumers want and desire most for their mobile features in banking or whatever industry we're testing. So that's a slightly different example of that, where we're sort of doing a hybrid approach, if you will, where we have real consumer input, but we have our kind of review of all the mobile properties, which we don't need consumers to review for us, because it's not really about making a judgment on how well or how different they're implemented. It's really whether it exists or not, right? Whether the capability or feature is available. Do you have anything else to add to that, Phil, or is that?
Yeah, fairly comprehensive.
Okay. Did that answer the question?
I think so. So we have another question here. What are the most common metrics that should be considered for benchmarking in a retail site?
Okay, well, there are definitely common metrics across kind of that you're always going to want to focus on with competitive benchmarking. So when you're putting someone on a task, how successful are they? How long did it take to do the task? And then for retail specifically, things like likelihood to return or likelihood to recommend a site, your typical NPS question. Yeah, anything else specific to retail, Dana, that you would mention?
I mean, we always do a lot having to do with the purchase process, right? So, you know, is it too long? I mean, there's certain metrics that are trackable that, you know, if the purchase process is too long, we do a lot about pricing, we do a lot about convenience, we do research. So there's a lot of tools out there, and when we look at competitive sets, which is the easiest to find a product to narrow down, browsing versus searching. So we usually split those out separately because they're very different experience. So browsing the site by category to find something versus using the search feature, and then what tools are available for narrowing down search results. I mean, there's a lot of metrics around sort of all of those sort of areas that we track. Then, you know, obviously the big ones are the effect that the site experience had on the brand, the likelihood to, you know, all the conversion metrics, likelihood to return and purchase and recommend and all of that, of course. How satisfied they were with the experience. I think that covers it.
Great. So I think we have time for one more, so I'll just pick one more. We'll wrap it up here, and any questions we didn't get to answer, we will reach out to you directly. So our last question today will be, any tips for analysis of all of this data?
Well, I think we touched on a few tips. I guess the number one thing is that you're designing for your analysis, and I know that we kind of hit on this multiple times, but it really can't be underemphasized. When you're planning your study, when you're scripting it in an online tool, you really have to think about how that data is going to look once the study is complete. So that involves, you know, thinking through it. That involves testing the study and looking at the exports that you're going to use. It's so important to make sure that you're doing everything you can to make your analysis as easy as possible.
And some of the tools have limitations, I'll add to that, of, you know, we're talking about like understanding the reporting tools. So sometimes it can be two very different interfaces, one where you're putting in the questions and you're sort of structuring your study design, and the other is on the other side once all the data's been collected, and then you're exporting things or you're filtering things, and some of them have much more powerful tools than others. Some of them have limitations to what you can do on the back end, so to speak, with the data. And again, in a lot of our studies, we're talking about collectively, you know, 1,000 or more, you know, people across, let's say, 60 different data points. And we're talking about a tremendous amount of data. So you really want to know what you're dealing with in terms of your options for data analysis and how you're going to handle it before you start, you know, before you field. It's not something to sort of, oh, we'll figure it out later. And then, of course, year over year, you're basically updating your data set with the new data and doing comparative analysis of, you know, if it's an annual benchmark, for instance, it's, you know, you're comparing this year's to last year's. And again, you know, you want to have all that set up and be able to do as much as possible in the most efficient way. And again, I'll mention one more time my former coworker who used to say you can just set up your report while it's fielding. And you could set up the whole framework for your report and know exactly what you're going to do with every piece of information, or you didn't do your benchmarking study right if you don't already know where everything's going to go and what your story is going to look like. You don't know the story yet, but you know you have the framework, you have the outline written, so to speak.
Thank you so much, Dana and Phil. You guys did a great job presenting today. We hope all the attendees got a lot of information out of this webinar, and I believe that they did. For any questions on this topic, or if you are interested in working with Keyline on some quantitative research, you can get in touch with us by emailing marketing@keylineinteractive.com. So we're going to go ahead and conclude our webinar today. We do have an upcoming webinar that's going to be on the death of the 6-week research project. This is going to be at the end of next month on Thursday, August 25th, and we do have a registration link available now if you guys want to visit that bit.ly link to go ahead and get registered. This is going to be with our user research, Eugene, and he's going to be talking about how research is changing, how Keyline is ushering this change along, and the impact it's having on product design as a whole. So don't miss it. Dana, did you have
It's going to be a great webinar. Don't miss that one.
I thought I heard something said. Okay, thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate it. Have a great afternoon, and thanks for having us.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.